Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. A particular shout out to our attendees in Melbourne today. I hope you are remaining as safe as possible and that we can break up your day a little bit. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jessica Bean, and it is the greatest honour to be Chair for Patient Voice Initiative. I am also a patient living with cystic fibrosis and diabetes, and for me, this work is a deeply personal mission. If this is your first PVI event, welcome. PVI is a multi-stakeholder organisation working to enhance the voice of patients in healthcare decision-making. 2 years ago this month, our first piece of work as an association was the release of a report which we entitled Recommendations to Improve the Patient Voice in Health Technology Assessment in Australia. Really catchy. You can find that report on our website, but in it we identified 4 areas, priority areas for change: legislation and procedure, training and guidance, evidence generation and communication. Since that time, PVI, as well as many other stakeholders, have been actively working within these areas on ways forward, particularly recognising the increasing importance of patient involvement to meet the needs and concerns of the current healthcare environment. We've seen some really promising progress in this space, particularly the creation of the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit. PVI's work has focused on connecting patients to essential resources, building capacity of both patients and patient groups, and promoting dialogue, collaboration, and involvement between stakeholders. Under the pillar of evidence generation, patient-based evidence is an area that we have really noticed an increased interest, evident by the exceptional demand on registration for this session today, and a need for more resources. So we're really thrilled to be kicking off this series. This workshop was supposed to be an in-person training, building on the face-to-face event we were very fortunate to squeeze in at the start of the year. However, as is the way of 2020, here we are. This has, though, given us the opportunity to bring a broader range of speakers to you and also enable the content to be more accessible to a wider audience. Please don't forget to sign up to the other webinars in this series, which will be running for the next few Fridays, and to follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn for updates of other work that we're planning on this topic. I'd like to particularly thank our sponsors today for making these events possible and free, because cost shouldn't be the barrier to making this type of knowledge broadly accessible. But we know, particularly for patients and patient groups, this can be the case. Today, we have an absolutely fantastic speaker lineup, starting with Jo Watson, who is Deputy Chair of the PBAC and Consumer Representative, and is an incredible champion in the space of patient involvement. We're very lucky to have her in Australia. We have Dr. Simon Fifer, who's Director of Innovation and Research at CaPPRe, and also a Patient Voice Initiative Steering Committee member. Finally, we have Steve Roach, CEO and Nella Combe of Myeloma Australia. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. Questions at the end will be chaired by Anne Single, who is part of the PVI team, but also chair of the HTAI Patient, Citizen and Involvement Group. Before I hand over to Jo, just a couple of housekeeping matters. As I said, we will be running questions at the end, and you can put the questions in the main chat throughout the session. As this session was intended for patients and patient groups, these participant questions will be prioritised. So we ask if you're not one of these groups that you can add your title or organisation at the end of your question, and if we have time, we might be able to get to them. Or they'll also help us to understand where the needs are for future content. Your cameras will be turned off throughout the session, and so will your microphones. This session will be recorded, however, we probably won't be sending out the slide deck. That's probably enough from me. Thank you all again for being here, and it's over to you, Jo.
Morning, everyone, and I'm very pleased to be with you all this morning as I just get my screen up. So, there we go. Okay, so I thought I'd run through in the time I've got this morning, just trying to talk a little bit about how we think about HTA in terms of its definition. What we mean, I think, when we try and talk about the patient principles and the patient-centeredness of HTA. Why does that matter? And what I think are some of the current frameworks that are used in trying to elicit and solicit patient or consumer inputs, and then what might lay ahead. As Jessica said in the introduction, I'm the current Deputy Chair of the PBAC, but I'm the Chair of the HTA Consumer Consultative Committee, and I have a very genuine passion for working through with all of you and others how best we can give life and reason to this notion of patient engagement, patient input and patient evidence. So, I mean, I think health technology assessment is thought about quite differently in terms of the different domains and the different players involved. But I'm coming at it, I guess, from the perspective of how the Australian health system considers health technology assessment, especially within the Commonwealth Department of Health and with the Australian government's national medicines policy, and how committee structures like PBAC or the Medical Services Advisory Committee and other such programs and processes within the Commonwealth think about the way they can assess things that are going to be subsidised or funded through Australian taxpayers. And so the focus is often on this notion of evaluations or assessments, but I think we also need to be very cognizant of the fact that it's quite fundamentally meant to be assessments or evaluations about how we consider a new health technology or a new medicine or device is really going to enter into the lives of patients and the people who are ultimately the users and recipients. The HTAI International Group has a definition that I think a lot of people are very keen to see more widely adopted and understood, in the sense that it talks about something a bit more broader than just as a sort of a single or direct tool, but talks about it in terms of understanding how a technology is also going to affect and change fundamentally a broader system or a broader sense of health delivery structures and practices, and what it is that we can understand about the available knowledge of that technology or that new medicine, and what does that mean in terms of more wider implications around that new technology in terms of changing policy, changing practice, changing implementation processes within a system and the like. So trying to get away from this notion that it's of a single and central one point in time sort of decision or recommendation. I mean, ultimately, I think people are well familiar with the notion of value in healthcare nowadays, and health technology assessment is really just understood as one of several ways of understanding or determining the value of something. And whether it's Australia or in an international context, whether it's a broad whole of government system or whether it's a very specific agency or even private sector decision, people search for ways of understanding what a deliverable is going to cost. And they work at ways according to whether they're coming from a commercial interest, a government interest, or a payer interest, or other interests, what it is that purchase or that value is going to deliver. And I think for patients and the perspective of, again, the person ultimately wanting to use or take advantage of a health intervention, a new health intervention, what is the value that they want to attribute to that is being discussed? So a number of you are familiar with some of my earlier talks where I try and bring it back to a context of, again, the Australian government health technology assessment processes and what it is that we have enshrined either in legislation or in our own national medicine policy resources at the moment. And I think this notion that we are using processes where we are being challenged to consider the best available evidence and the most efficient ways that we can inform decision making across both committees, government level, departmental levels, about things that are going to be subsidised is something that we should continue to remind ourselves about. Ultimately, if we say we have a commitment to continually improve an evidence base for assessment, then we need to give some sort of visibility to how we're doing that. So in terms of then coming back to this notion of patient-based HTA, I think for most of us here today, we're talking about ways that we can consider looking at clinical and cost effectiveness, especially in our system, which is a comparative one. So in other words, we're trying to understand the clinical and cost effectiveness of something as it's compared to something else. And in our submission-driven processes, such as the PBAC, where we're given a submission by a sponsor, and a sponsor's nominating, if you like, what it is they'd like us to be comparing their item, their new drug or drugs to, for the purpose of that evaluation. And then what is it that we're saying is really the best way then to reflect how the patients themselves are valuing that, and valuing that in terms of either their current treatments, their current standard of care interventions, or the way that they understand what benefit this new drug or new medicines is going to provide. And why is it that the patient perspective is really going to be giving us an insight as a committee or as others making decisions around these things in terms of a patient's experience of living with a condition and indeed trying to manage that for the best or most optimal health outcome. And so why does it matter? Well, again, probably not news to this audience, but it matters for a range of reasons. And I think if we're talking about a critical assessment or evaluation health technology assessment, it's about considering outcomes of that intervention or that new medicine, and what it is that is meaningful and important for those who that new medicine is actually being developed for, or indeed is going to be delivered to. So being able to allow decision makers and purchasers, if you like, an opportunity to explore the issues around the clinical trial data, explore the issues around where or how that new technology or drug is really going to be best used or best positioned within a health system or within a delivery of service. And what it is that we can say about a patient experience or insight into these questions that really helps, hopefully, diminish what can be a range of levels of uncertainty, a word that, as you all know, HTA decision makers will often use in terms of trying to describe the deficits or gaps that are just not able to be brought forward through a clinical trial dossier or a set of analyses on clinical trial data alone. And I think we've seen time and again that the patient perspective and insights also helps in terms of understanding limitations and the impacts of toxicities and adverse events. And again, not in so much a black and white ruling of something out, but understanding the nuance or the way that that is synthesised within a person's own condition and their way of managing their condition, and how a patient themselves wants to talk about those experiences of impacts of toxicities and the like. And then finally, I think that more and more people are turning their minds to what is it that patient-based evidence can also tell us about not just the immediate impact of an intervention, but also what a new intervention may be able to offer in terms of longer-term sustainability of health of a person, and that sort of longer-term impact of a new entry into the market and into the clinical domain of something that may ultimately change the whole health of a population. And so does it make a difference? Well, you know, Anne Single and many others over the last couple of decades now have really tried to understand how it is that patient involvement, as it's grown and developed across HTA processes and regulatory processes, how it's really, if you like, had an impact on the processes themselves, and also whether or not there's ways of making more visible how patients are participating, not just in the decision-making processes, but what it is that may have actually, if you like, even turned decisions or indeed influenced eventual outcomes of those recommendations that usually come with a one decision. And so documenting the impact, I think, has become a more urgent need as we've all struggled to, if you like, give that visibility to what can be quite subtle and indirect ways that patient engagement and the experiences of patients have ended up influencing and adding more texture and depth to a range of discussions, analyses and reviews over what can be very significant and substantial periods of time as payers and others have tried to review new technologies as they've arrived. And I think the stories of patient impact through articles such as the Single article, articles that have been published in other journals, talk about the way that the patient engagement can, if you like, inform the models that are proposed by sponsors, can help decision makers really understand if there are specific issues that, as I've mentioned before, may be providing uncertainty to a committee, that may in fact have some real gaps or deficits in terms of understanding, and where patient communication and liaison has really helped, I think, deliver some outcomes in terms of some more assurances around decisions that are made. I think where we would all agree is still a lot of work to be done is how we document better those sort of impacts and influences, and how we can bring more understanding to the way processes are indeed, I think, many of them anyway, currently influenced in terms of patient inputs coming in. And I think that lack of communication about how that happens is something that we're all aware of. So in terms of, you know, what sort of information or data or patient evidence does matter, I've listed here a few things that I think are pretty standard in terms of the way that they're understood. You know, whether it's by written template or submissions that come in through representation of consumer hearings and stakeholder meetings from the patient organisations and networks, whether it's surveys and qualitative research and reports that are done on behalf of a patient organisation or indeed by a sponsor as they are working through their submissions themselves. I think there's a range now of different ways that we can see inputs delivered. I think we're getting now to some pointy ends of the discussion, and I welcome today's webinar for this reason, as to what it is that we're saying about the quality and if you like, the focus of a number of these inputs that can really, I think, land in a more specific way to some of the very complexities of a submission that require that sort of, if you like, focus and attention. At the end of the day, a system that will passively receive information and inputs from doctors, patients, or the like, and not be able to take in a more active way inputs and evidence that is going to really hone in on what is a specific issue of deliberation, complexity, or contention, is really missing some opportunities. And I think we are all very keen to see if there are some ways that we can improve on that, not just in our system here, but I think it's a focus of international interest as well. And obviously there are other inputs, as I just referred, in terms of inputs that come in not from specific patients or patient groups, but also in terms of what comes in through the public. Our system here in Australia, especially for MSAC and PBAC purposes, will receive input from a variety of stakeholders and in different ways. And again, I think this underlines my point that that can be often a missed opportunity in terms of what we say may be some key issues or uncertainties, but we're not garnering that in a better way to target what is really up for debate. So in a couple of my last slides, I just want to sort of frame, if you like, where I think this leaves us. I mean, I think the critical debates at the moment are around these notions of how better to integrate patient input across HTA processes, across not just our system, but various health systems. And what it is we want to say about the measure of impact as we try and evaluate the difference that patient evidence can make in terms of assessments and evaluations, and then ultimately final recommendations. And what is it we can say about things that we should be trying to get a better understanding about co-designing some of the strategies for some more formal input coming from patients themselves that will support the decision making along this notion of the patient centrality and the patient sort of ownership aspects of health technology assessment. And if we're going to be doing that, what is it that we can say are some real barriers there in terms of patient engagement still today that, if you like, negate some of the diversity of experience, but also at the same time can, if you like, go into some sort of conflict against this notion of an individual patient preference or insight versus what it is you want to say about a targeted patient population set of questions and issues. What it is we can do to try and reconcile some of those points of contention. And then finally, I think better articulating and understanding what it is we mean around the different methods and models of the various processes for health technology assessment, recognising that in fact there probably is not ever going to be a one-size-fits-all approach, and that very complexity of different ways of eliciting patient information and patient evidence is in fact the very reason why we continue to talk about this and try and consider so much of the various mechanisms. So again, coming back to Australia and the Australian health technology assessment context, these are some of the principles behind the Australian health technology assessment framework. And as those of you know, I continue to draw on this slide because I see it as a basic contract, if you like, to say that we have further opportunities to explore. The notion that we say that the Australian health technology assessment processes are going to be flexible and fit for purpose, are going to be informed by relevant evidence, and are going to be reflective of Australian community values, makes me feel that we have ways here of continuing to test and interrogate various methods and innovations as we can put them together in a reasonable way within those frameworks. So making a difference, I think, over the more immediate future is working out ways that we can actually address a specific submission proposed so that the increased patient involvement becomes more nuanced and targeted, that we can actually talk about ways to see a new interventional medicine understood in the way it's going to be utilised by a specific population or populations, and talk to that quite in a quite detailed way, as opposed to a broader whole of population discussion, because more and more we're seeing technologies introduced that are very specific to subpopulations. What is it we're saying about the development of appropriate methodologies for patient evidence coming through that is going to fit into various frameworks and can demonstrate best practice, accepting that it is methodologies plural, and that to progress it, we're going to understand better with research and with data how it is that those can actually affect decision making and be useful in that sense of a framework of technology assessment. And then finally, what it is that the contribution of patients are making that can be understood and more better given some sort of visibility to. If we're going to give notion to this idea all the time of patient input, let's start giving more formal feedback and more formal reporting, if you like, to that notion of direct and indirect impacts on decision making and recommendations. And I might make the point that that may not always be about whether or not something is actually listed or eventually subsidised in the way it's been proposed, but that the patient evidence has in fact been an incredible, valuable way of reshaping what that submission ultimately ends up looking like when something is finally able to be delivered to the patient group that's going to get most benefit. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jo. I've had the pleasure of seeing Jo speak quite a few times now, and there's always something new or different that jumps out at me. I think you'll agree it's a great opportunity to have Jo here and to ask her questions. She's agreed to answer some questions at the end, so please don't forget to pop them in the chat and we will get to them at the end. Next up, we have Dr. Simon Fifer of CaPPRe. Simon also sits on the PVI steering committee, and I know how passionate he is about patient-based evidence, and really looking forward to hearing his presentation today. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thank you, Jess. Just one moment. So thanks very much, everyone. And thanks, Jo, for that great introduction. Very much covered off some of the, I guess, the core areas of our system in Australia, and certainly a good lead into evidence-based, I guess, studies, and particularly some of the studies I'm going to talk about in terms of patient preferences. So that's fantastic. So I am going to be talking about patient preferences, and as Jo mentioned, it's one of the methodologies, and I know we're going to go through others through the webinar series. This is one of the ones that are probably most widely used in terms of understanding what patients value and their preferences around the world, not obviously just in Australia, but so I'm going to take you through the basics. So what are they, why and when we should use them, what do you get out of them, so what are the outputs? How can they be used in assessment? So in health technology assessment, like what Jo has just defined, and obviously what their core responsibilities are, and then touch on briefly just on a case study, but I'll leave more of that to the following speakers in terms of Steve and Nella as well. So in regards to what they are trade-off methods. So trying to understand, I guess, in this representation here is balance between features. So what's more important to people when they're making decisions? They are experiments, they do often come in surveys, but where you can see here with that illustration is we're balancing up, say, risks and costs versus benefits And then there's other things in the middle, which we could call non-health factors, but things like the frequency of the treatment, the type of mode, for example, an oral versus a subcut. So they're the types of balancing and trade-offs that we're looking at. That will become more clear as I take you through this presentation. But just as an illustration, think about it like the trade-offs that we make. That's going to be core to everything that we touch on throughout this presentation. So I mentioned patient preferences. One of the key types of methods that we can use within patient preferences is discrete choice experiments. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail other than they are doing surveys, we are doing experiments, and I'm going to call them DCEs. So I don't want to say that long name all the time, but just think as preferences and DCEs, which is a common method that we use in this space. The example that I'm showing you here is from basically high-speed broadband. So how do we make choices? So often we go to comparison websites, stack everything up and look at what's important, then we can make a choice. Now this is an example of one scenario. You can see here, we did this back when it was ADSL2 versus high-speed broadband. So back when the NBN was coming into Australia. But you have a choice between what you have now and these three options in this case, Optus, iiNet, and Telstra, based on those certain plans. So if we all have a look at scenario one, and then what we do is we introduce another scenario. And you can see here, some of the brands are the same, some of the brands are different, but those features, the way we're describing the plans are different. So you can see here, now I have to reevaluate my decision. So what I made in one is not the same that I necessarily make in two. And that's the structure behind these experiments and these surveys that we create. We're trying to mimic real world situations where people make decisions. And what we are doing is it's not just one or two scenarios, it's multiple scenarios. So for example, just to give you an illustration, it might be between 8 and 12 scenarios, depending on the design that we use. And we are asking people to make trade-offs. So look at what's most important, evaluate it under your own criteria, and select what you would choose. So what maximizes value for you? And Joe was defining value before, and keep that in mind. So what is important to you as a patient? What defines value? What would I choose? Over those choices, we don't have to ask you what's important to you. We don't ask you to rate or rank or score things on surveys like you may have seen before. All you have to do is choose, and your choices determine what you value over those scenarios. So that's the underlying premise behind how DCEs work. And I wanted to give you an illustration outside of health, just because I'm sure we've all chosen broadband before, and you can probably understand what am I valuing here? Is it just the plan price? Is it the speed? Is it the contract? Is it the brand? And now think about that, how it might apply as we move forward into these health examples. And this is a real basic one that I just created to show you an illustration. They don't always look like this, but just to show you two scenarios within a health example. So you can see here we have scenario one, scenario two. We have three features or attributes: administration, frequency, and cost. And then we have two treatments, just A and B, and an opt-out, which is basically I wouldn't choose any of these or neither. And so if you were to make a choice to see what's important to you in scenario one, you make a choice. And then we go to scenario two. The administration has stayed the same, but frequency and cost have changed. And so we're looking to see whether you would change from what you chose before to what you would choose in two. And as per the NBN illustration before, then there's scenario 3, 4, 5, maybe up to 10. And so what we're trying to see is how you make choices based on how we change the experiment. And then we can determine what's important to you and what you value. I'm just going to briefly touch on some terminology, some common terminology, so you're aware of when we're talking about these types of preference studies, what are we talking about? If you were to go and look these things up, these are the words that we would use to describe the core aspects of these experiments. So we have an alternative. So you can see here, when I said before A versus B, that's what we would call an alternative. At the moment, I'm calling it generic because A and B don't mean anything. They're just a label. So I could have A, B, C, which would be three alternatives. But sometimes I have something that is a little bit more specific as the label. For example, it might be surgery versus a medicine. So the label could just be an A or a B or something along those lines, which we call generic, or something specific, which could be surgery versus a medicine or a particular type of intervention. The attribute or the features is then what we have, how are we describing that particular alternative? So that when we do that and we come up with these attributes, we often start with obviously talking to people through qualitative work, looking back at other studies and literature that have been done, and talking obviously with advocacy groups, which we often partner with. What is important to people when they make this decision? And they're the key things we want to have included here. So we don't want to leave anything out. So I've shown you 3 attributes here, but often the studies might have more than that, because however people evaluate the situation is how many features I want to present, because then I'm trying to model how they make trade-offs. And if I leave one out, I'm going to actually miss out, and it's going to be incorrect in terms of our evaluation. So that's an attribute. How we describe those attributes are what we call levels. So in this case, administration has a level for oral and a level for injection, and it could have had a level for an infusion. So there are multiple levels. So we have attributes which describe the alternative, and then we have levels which describe those particular features or attributes. And overall, between those, the whole package is called a scenario generally. And we show multiple scenarios within an experiment, and we ask people to make a choice. So that's really the basics of what a DCE is, or some of these preference experiments. That's what they include, and they're the core things that we focus on, obviously when people are completing them, but also when we're designing them. So that if you're going to get into doing a preference study, the attributes, the levels, the alternatives, they're the things that you're going to have to think about, and the framing of the task as well. So what information do you provide to people? What context do you provide when people are making their decisions? So that's really what are they? And I'm now going to touch on, I guess, why and when we should use them. And that will sort of flow on throughout the next couple of points as well, but this is just in a general idea. So why we're using them is really to enhance evidence. So Joe has established prior that obviously we're trying to look at evidence, and this is one way where we can gain evidence about patient preferences and values. So it is really trying to work out for these patients, or for segments of patients or individuals, or for the larger group, a value framework so we can help make decisions that are patient-centered. And I think Joe made it a point quite clearly before, particularly in the HTA process, is it's often about comparing a new intervention, a new treatment versus the existing. So versus what they currently have available. And that is very much what these methods are designed to do. Because once we know how important the attributes or features are, we can put any treatment configuration in there. So we can put 3 options that people currently have versus a new one that's coming out next year. How much more value, and think of the word value that Joe was defining before, how much more value does this treatment bring to people living with this condition? So keep that in mind as we sort of go through as well. In terms of where they're being used, at the moment, we've been talking mostly about reimbursement. So an assessment, and do certain products get reimbursed for patients in Australia, but they are being used in terms of treatments and interventions that are getting approved in terms of regulatory approval. So are they available in the countries? And then it's even moving further back to that. So you can see how making trade-offs, we can determine what's important to people, how that might be important in clinical trials to work out what should we be measuring in clinical trials that's relevant to the patient. And even because these experiments are hypothetical, it goes back even further than that, because we can look at, okay, what if there's something that's not available at this point in time, but we could work on developing that. So what if in an area people have to take an injection twice a day? What if there was an oral that could be developed in that space? What would that mean to people? So it goes all back into R&D as well. So think about it across the whole spectrum. Getting patient input and evidence on preferences can be beneficial across all of these areas. So what do you get out of these studies? The model provides basically a value for every attribute. So how sensitive and how important that attribute is to everyone. As I said, to an individual, which I sort of talk about in my case study at the end, or to segments, or to the total group that we're talking about. The overall value or satisfaction for a particular treatment is then just the sum of those features. So if a particular product had an oral and it was given once a day and it was of a certain cost, that's where that total value for that treatment comes from. And if I was comparing another treatment, it would just be the sum of the features of that particular treatment. So just think in a very simplistic term, that's what we're doing. We're valuing the importance of every feature, and then we can map that back to a particular treatment using a formula similar to this, which is basically a utility-based measure. Now, the key part here is, and Joe outlined it as well before, is patients can have different values. So it's not just always we're looking at aggregate. So what does everyone want? What about what's the key thing of these particular types of work and these models is we can allow for differences. We can allow for segments, we can allow for individuals. And that's pretty key. And the way we term that in this type of work is it's variation, but essentially heterogeneity, is people can have different preferences and the model can pick those up. And then we can look at maybe a treatment's more relevant to this subgroup versus this subgroup, because this other group are happy with what they have, but this other group are really seeking something else because of certain particular features. So that's an important part of what you can do in these types of models. In terms of taking that a step further, so I mentioned the value, so attribute importance and the levels associated with those features. So how important is each attribute compared to another? So it's always relative. So for example, the risk of side effects might be twice as important to someone as opposed to the mode, or as opposed to the frequency. So those are the types of things that the model is measuring, so attribute importance. And then what we can do is align those to treatments, which is where I'm talking about treatment uptake or preference. And I'll show you an illustration of this because it probably makes it a little bit easier for you. When we use these models, they do prepare parameter estimates, which I'm not going to focus on, but we present them in an interactive way, normally in dashboards. And it allows us to put any treatment configuration and perform what-if scenarios. And back to those two core outputs that I mentioned that the model gives us, in this dashboard, you can see an illustration of that is you can see preferences. So between A and B, based on this model, what proportion of patients prefer B versus A? And these could be real treatments. So you can see the features down there. If I say, oh, this treatment has these features, this treatment has these features, 54% prefer this over this. So that's one thing that the model can do. And very interesting, obviously, when we're mapping new treatments versus existing. You can see how much more additional value this new treatment would bring. And then obviously attribute importance. So in this case, from a cancer-based study, you can see survival, remission, out-of-pocket costs. So how much more important is an attribute relative to another? And this is on the aggregate. What about segments? What about individuals when they're making decisions? How do they differ? So we can actually get those from the models also. Okay, now thinking more about our assessment process and the other parts around the world where they use health technology assessment that Joe has covered off before us, is what can these models do to assist and provide evidence? So which areas would it be probably beneficial to have a preference study? One of those areas, which I mentioned earlier, is say non-health benefits. So sometimes these aspects don't get included in the current evidence stream. So for example, in cost effectiveness, in clinical evidence, we don't sometimes get the value of the mode or the frequency. So what about an oral versus an injection versus an infusion? Patients have a value for those particular modes. We can use these methods to get to those values and show the differences comparatively to the other treatments. What about when there's a number of options for patients? All those particular options of treatment are very different on the features. These methods can actually differentiate to show where certain patients would go for this treatment over another. If it's a very complicated landscape, identifying the decision processes that people use to make these decisions would be quite important. And obviously providing that to assessors and evaluators when they're making their decisions about what treatments to reimburse, you can see how that evidence could be used to guide them as to what people are looking for and how they make comparisons between treatments. What are they thinking about? What's important to them when they make these decisions? Basically, heterogeneity in the population, so variation, so differences between patients. So patients might be coming from less severe versus more severe. Patients might have more experience versus less experience. Patients might live in regional versus metro areas. Differences between patients can come. What are they looking for? We know not everyone's the same, and these models can get to some of those underlying differences. So it's not just variation in people's preferences, it's variation in the people that we're talking to and how that links to their preferences. So there's two things, variation in preferences and obviously variation in the people living with the condition. And how does that matter? And so we can actually capture that as well through these types of models and segmentation-based assessment. And another key area, which is particularly relevant, is in new treatment decisions. So not just new things that are coming into the market versus comparators, but what about new things that people haven't experienced before? Because these methods are hypothetical, I can actually propose what-if scenarios. So what about this work in genomics and genetics? How it's changing rapidly? What are patients looking for? How would they make decisions? under uncertainty and various risk benefits. These models can be used to get to some of those underlying issues. And the other part of that is where there's lack of evidence, say, for example, in rare conditions. So in rare conditions, in some of our areas, in some of our submissions, we may not have great evidence or evidence from Australia from clinical trials. Maybe we could talk to patients here about their preferences, and that could add to the evidence that the evaluators have when they make their decisions. So new treatments, things that are coming out, very new, like genomics and genetics, and rare conditions as well, where we need to generate more evidence, it would be beneficial. Okay, so I've really just gone through the basics for you. I've obviously gone through it relatively quickly within this short amount of time, obviously open to questions, but I thought this would be a nice illustration just to think about, because I've been talking about how we do these studies, going out to populations, to people, to samples. What about individuals? And you can see what it might be for me and what it might be for you when you're completing this. And this will probably link in with what Steve's talking about. So I won't cover it in a great deal of detail, but I really do want to just talk about how it maps to an individual. And then we can roll it all the way back up. If I can get to an individual's preferences, then I can get to segments, then I can get to the total population. But just have a think about it for you as a person making decisions, how that would relate. One of the things we're talking about here is using this individual preferences for shared decision making. Key reasons that we're doing this, linked to some of the things that we presented there, is empowering patients to get information and use it in their own treatment decision context. So they have greater control. Once I know my own, obviously they know their own preferences, but they have a model that can help them, and they have a report that they can use in discussions with some of their healthcare team. If we can align preferences in those discussions with what patients value and what an individual wants, it will lead to improved outcomes. And so that's the stepping stone between that, and obviously trying to build a community as we move through. And as I said, that will lead to some of the other things that you're probably going to hear today as well. I did just want to talk about, I haven't talked a lot about how you do these types of experiments. I can certainly answer questions. Part of PVI and the team that we're working on is obviously creating resources to help you, and also linking researchers as well. So that's ongoing work that the PVI steering committee are working on, is making sure that these methods are accessible, and you can obviously link and learn from people that actually do this type of work, like myself and others. But we have developed an app to do this type of work, and that's just one way you can do it. Often you do it, you might use online surveys. You can do just standard face-to-face interviews. Obviously you can use paper and pencil. It doesn't really matter how you do it. But this is just one way where we had an idea to generate feedback. So we were using an application to give feedback about how people, what they value when they're making choices under particular decisions. So I'm just going to leave you with this. So think about, I showed you a few examples before. You saw the NBN, you saw the other health examples. But really, if I was looking at it for me, in this particular context, would I use this treatment or would I not use this treatment? Choose the green, choose the red. Use it green, not use it red. If I was to do multiple scenarios, exactly the same way that I talked about the other experiments, I get a report for myself about what's important to me and what I value. I can then share that with my nurse, with my partner, with my carer, with my doctor. And basically I can track that over time and say, okay, this is what I value now. This is what's important to me. You know, let's talk about side effects, for example, because that's really important to me. It might not have been important to someone else, but it's really important to me. Well, the mode's really important to me because I don't want to have to travel a certain number of kilometers to obviously get to the hospital to take that particular treatment. That might not be relevant for everyone, but it's relevant for this particular person when they make their decisions. So I guess it's part of get to those underlying reasons in a systematic way to help guide conversation. It's not choosing treatments for anyone. It's not selecting a treatment versus another in this case. All it's doing is providing information about what's important to you when you make decisions. So I'll just leave you with that. Think about the individual and then think how we scale that back up. Scale that back up to all the other studies. If we're talking to any other patient group, we can do very similar methods on a larger scale. So thank you very much, everyone. Certainly open for questions later. I know I've gone through it fast, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was fantastic. And I think everyone will agree that you have a real talent for explaining these concepts in a really accessible and engaging way, which is fantastic.
Thanks, Jess.
Next up, we have Steve Roach and Nella Combe from Myeloma Australia. When we were looking at these workshops, it was really important to us that we were able to bring in patient experience or patient group experiences and patients directly. So we were really thrilled when Steve agreed to come and present to us today. Thank you so much for your time. I know that it's particularly busy for you at the moment, but we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Simon, for a great presentation. Nella and I aren't going to have a slideshow today, but we want to talk you through our experience at Myeloma Australia of having worked with Simon and his team and patient preferences and where it's taken us to as an organisation. And I think to know that, it's important to know where we came from. And Myeloma Australia has been around for around 22 years now. It was started by 3 carers because they found there was no information to be found when their wives were diagnosed with myeloma, and they got together and formed this little group in Victoria originally, which has grown now to a national organisation. And it was run by volunteers for around 10 years, based around initially support groups, and we still have over 60 support groups around the country, and they're growing. But it's always been about informing and listening to patients. That is one of the raison d'etres for Myeloma Australia existing. And when it was run by volunteers, that's the way it was. And at the point when the people that started it decided to turn it over to employees and employ people to run the organisation, they took on nurses. And we have specialised myeloma nurses who deliver our programs to patients around Australia. Nella Combe, who's with me here today, is the manager of those patient and nursing programs in Australia, and has been heavily involved in the studies and the work of patient preferences over the last 4 or 5 years. So from that point, I suppose we've always been about empowering patients, from whether it was our volunteers who started us to the organisation we are now. We've listened to patients, and sometimes it was about how they felt and sometimes it was what they thought. But what we really have needed was evidence-based material, evidence-based information that when we felt something, we could prove it. And I suppose that is always the problem when you're speaking from the heart about from a patient group, and everyone knows how passionate you are or how passionate we are. How do we prove that what we're feeling and what we're thinking and what we're seeing is true? And our experience with patient preferences has really helped us do that. So from that point, I suppose as a starting point, and understanding who we are and where we're coming from as an organisation, you can probably see why we would want to get involved in something like this. And Nella can talk a little bit more about now. We'll switch back and forth a little, do a little toe tapping show as we for the next 15 minutes or so. But Nella might talk now a little bit about the work we've done with CaPPRe and what it's meant for our patients and our nurses, and how we've done that. So to you, Nella.
Great, thanks, Steve. I hope everybody can hear me. You don't get much feedback through these Zoom webinars from everybody else, and it's always a little nerve-wracking when you're talking to people that you can't see. Anyway, please let me know if you can't hear or anything like that. So I will just give a little outline of who we are in terms of our services at Myeloma Australia, and then I'll talk a little bit about myeloma, just to lay a bit of, I suppose, put down a bit of a background on and lead into the patient preferences study that we did. So as Steve mentioned, our nurses deliver services to myeloma patients and carers within the community all around Australia. We have 15 around the country. All of our nurses work part-time for us, and then they also work part-time clinically in hospitals caring for people with myeloma. So they're providing education and support. They're involved in discussions about treatments. We provide advocacy in our clinical roles and also in our work with Myeloma Australia too. Our main programs that we run are, as Steve said, patient support groups, which are open to patients and carers. We have a telephone support line where people can call up and speak to a myeloma specialist nurse anytime that they need to. We also run education days to help people understand their illness better, as well as what treatments are available and what's coming in terms of new research and new drugs and treatments. And we also have a fairly big portion of what we do in terms of supporting and educating and connecting the medical community, and that's doctors, researchers, nurses, allied health, anyone who's involved in caring for myeloma patients. So what is myeloma? I'll keep this pretty brief so that I don't take too much time from talking about the research, but it's a blood cancer. It's a rare blood cancer. About 1,800 people are diagnosed in Australia every year, and it's often confused with melanoma. It's not, most people don't hear about it unless someone that they know has been diagnosed. There are about 20,000 people living with myeloma. It has a median overall survival of 5 years, and it's an incurable blood cancer where people have treatment which brings their disease under control or into a period of remission, but eventually all people will relapse and their myeloma will come back, and they'll need to either start a new treatment or change the treatment that they were on. But it's a remitting and relapsing condition where people need treatment pretty much all of the time. And with those treatments, each time that they relapse, their remission period usually becomes shorter, and they also have a lot of toxicity from previous treatments. So I just felt that that might be a little bit of a good idea for you guys to get your head around what sort of patients that we look after, because I'm sure that all of you will have your own communities that have their own specific needs. And when we worked with CaPPRe in developing this this research model into patient preferences, there was a lot of consultation that went on to make sure that we really understood the myeloma, people's journey with myeloma and the different aspects to decision making and preferences. And so we were able to design a study that that was very relevant to our population. So Simon has gone into already some of the different sort of domains that we are able to, patients are able to select. And in ours, we had overall survival and remission was one of the domains. Side effects, were they mild or moderate or severe? Were they short or long-lived? The mode of frequency and administration of the medication, and out-of-pocket costs. So we use these different domains. We had a survey set up for patients, a survey set up for carers, and also nurses and doctors. So there were 4 separate surveys, and each of those groups went through and looked at those different treatments, treatment A versus treatment B, and decided which one they would go with, or as Simon mentioned, they could say that they would not be able to choose and choose neither. So overall, we recruited 124 patients, 43 carers, 34 nurses, and 28 physicians. Alongside of this quantitative research, there was the qualitative component where we had interviews with participants from each of those 4 categories as well. This was the first study that was ever done that actually was looking at treatment preferences of myeloma patients and doctors, nurses and carers. So really important for us to actually be able to get some data behind what we see in our practice, and we know from talking to people what they value, that sort of thing, but it's very hard to be able to present that in a way that shows that, in a robust way where there is the evidence behind it. So overall, the results that we found were that the preferences were aligned between the 4 areas. However, there were subtleties in differences between whether they what they valued more highly. Overall survival was valued by all 4 groups as the most important, and then treatment mode and frequency, as well as remission period, out-of-pocket costs, and the different side effects were all, there were subtle differences in what patients valued versus carers and doctors and nurses. And the paper is published, so it can be, you can go through and have a look at that if that's something that you'd like to know more about. But overall, you know, it showed us that patients and the other groups as well, they value the clinical data and the clinical components to treatment choices, but also there are a number of non-clinical factors that are important, and this can then guide shared decision making as well as impact on the patient's adherence to treatment down the track, and how they go on their treatment, which will have an impact on how long how long their overall survival is and how well they do. So I think I've probably said enough at the moment. I'll flick back over to Steve, and he can talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of the research.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nella. What we found interesting was that when we presented this to doctors, their feedback, it was that the nuances, and doctors know their patients well, and they believe they know their patients well, and in most cases they do. But some of the subtle nuances between what patients thought and what doctors thought they thought were really interesting, and some of the interesting dialogue that came out of that. But also just the fact that giving patients a voice and how patients felt about that was really important. And the patients, the feedback, like, we could have told you we thought that, but the fact is that now we have it in a scientific-based study that says this is what people are thinking. This is the, and for us to gain the insight and verification of what we felt we knew, but we couldn't prove, and then to be able to feed that back to all the people in our community, the patients, the carers, the nurses, the doctors, everybody as a group, and see how well that information was accepted was exceptional. And now to have that published and to see everyone reading that is, and saying, this is absolutely brilliant for the myeloma community broadly, because we have a way of hearing a patient's voice, and for those voices to be verified and in a scientific way, and that has been exceptional from a patient's perspective, because it makes their voice louder, and that's really important.
Can I just add something to that,
Sure.
Steve?
Absolutely, Nella.
Not only does it make their voice louder, but it helps them to be able to shape their voice and to be able to really articulate and communicate what is important to them, because sometimes, you know, when you are making decisions like this that patients are faced with, it's not, you know, there's emotion attached to it. It's very real. It's not so much, it's not as simple as deciding what broadband you're going to get, and then you can change your mind down the track if you don't like iiNet or whatever. So that's certainly something that I saw from doing the study, was that it allowed people to work through all of the different factors that and their values, and how they're all weighted, and how they change over time as well, because, you know, myeloma, as I mentioned, people have periods of remission and then relapse, and so people's preferences can also change over time, and we did find that in the research that that you could see that there were distinct groups as well with the analysis that was done later on down the track.
Yeah, and just getting patients involved was really easily as well, because patients wanted to have their voices heard. Carers as well, because carers, I'm sure we all know in our various communities that carers' voices aren't very often heard, and the opportunity for carers to have a point of view was really important. Nurses certainly wanted to be heard. Now, that wasn't quite as easy with doctors. They weren't as easy to recruit, but certainly they came on board. As Nella said, we had, I think, between 20 and 30 physicians on board, specialists in myeloma from around the country, and they were fantastic in the end. But we are very lucky to have a really involved physician community in myeloma. So, and that's great. But it was fantastic to get their feedback, but they weren't the easiest group to get involved in this, I must say, whereas the patients were very, very keen to be involved, and as were carers and nurses. So that was probably a little bit of a challenge, just getting the numbers of doctors to actually front up and give us their, and get involved in the study. But once they had, and once the results came out and they saw the value of those results, the feedback has been absolutely terrific from the medical community. So we are really pleased with that. And they do see the value of the patient voice. Being able to measure is just really important. And Joe talked about it, and Simon was talking about how it's done, and we all know that we want to be able to measure the patient's voices, measure their preferences, measure what's important to them, so that we can put a meaningful argument across for our patients at any time. And this is one way, this is something that's actually allowing us to do that. Because it gives us real life information based on real life science, and it's been incredibly important to us from that point of view. And it's taken us into other areas as well. And I think that's really important. You know, patients do want to be involved. We're always surveying our patients, and even though some of our surveys may not be based around the scientific soundness that Simon's studies are, we certainly are getting feedback from our patients and our carers all the time, and that's really important to us, and they see the value of that, and they see the value of having their voices heard. They don't see it as a useless exercise, I suppose, and that's really important. And patients are encouraged, they come to us asking how their voices can be heard even more, and we think that's really important too. And so this has had some really positive effects going forward, and opened other doors for us, Nella, hasn't it? So, which you might want to talk about.
Yeah, thanks. It has led on to a new project that we're working alongside CaPPRe with about the shared decision making. And Simon touched on this in his last two slides. And this is testing the Choice app specific to our community, where patients are, before they have their appointment with their doctor, when they're deciding, deciding on what that new treatment might be, when their myeloma is coming back and they need to start something new, going through the Choices app to be able to input what's important to them and what they value at that particular time point. This then generates a report, and the patient can take that to their consultation and use that as a discussion point and help to shape their conversation and their voice in the discussion about what's important to them. So that's something really exciting that we've been working on with CaPPRe for a little while now, and we're just about to wrap up recruiting to that. So we yeah, excited to see what comes out of it and see it utilised more, because it can be difficult for people to have those conversations, and particularly in those consultations where the doctors are quite time poor and a lot of information is decided upon and given.
Thanks, Nell. Yeah, well, so I'll wind up now just by saying that it's been very important to us. It's been very important to our patient population. As an organisation, it's really helped us be clear in our way forward in terms of giving patients a voice and where to get the facts around that voice, because it's easy to get distracted by the loudest voice, but sometimes it's important to hear the right voices, and this is one of the things that patient preferences are doing for us. So we're really pleased to have been involved in this so far. We are using, on a daily basis, using the lessons learned out of this, and our patients are aware that their preferences are important. And we thank CaPPRe for their involvement, and thank everybody today for the opportunity to let you know about what's been happening at Myeloma Australia with this study. So thank you all very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve and Nella, as well as Simon and Joe. They were absolutely fascinating presentations, as is evidenced by the questions pouring in. So I will ask some questions. The first question is actually for Nella and Steve, and that question was how, when you decided as a patient organisation that you wanted to move maybe from the insights to the evidence, what were the biggest challenges there in getting research up and running, and are there any tips for the rookies?
Well, there's a couple of things about that. It's difficult because we all think we know we think we know sometimes, don't we? And but I must say, I think Simon and his organisation, having them to work with, having somebody that understood. We didn't understand, we knew what we wanted, but we didn't know exactly how to get it, and they did. And I think that was really important. Partnering with the right people instead of going with what we think we knew was really important. Nella, you?
Yeah, I second that. We're a very small organisation. We don't have the, we've always wanted to move into research like this, but it's very difficult to find the time and the expertise to be able to do that. So partnering with a research organisation like CaPPRe was very easy and made it achievable for us. As I said, we're 15 nurses and our whole organisation is 20 people, and we all work part-time. So trying to do the best with what we can and utilise outside expertise where available.
Thanks for that. Patricia asked, Nella, are all the nurses that work in this, are they all qualified in this field? Are they specialists in the field?
They are. So all of our nurses are, they have at least 5 years experience in either haematology or oncology. They have all postgraduate studies in haematology or oncology, and they're all working in clinical roles. So they've got their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the hospitals and what the treatments are and what patients are experiencing from the hospital perspective.
Thanks. And this question is, I think this is for you, Simon, if you want to turn your camera on and mic on. And I'm going to join two questions together here. One of them is, how are patients' lived experiences involved in the design stage of the DCE experiments? And joining that with Gillian's question, which was about how you make sure you capture the factors in your attributes that are important to patients, and also that it's as broadly accessible to as many as possible.
Thanks for that, Anne. I think it very much ties in with what great example that Steve and Nella have just gone through in terms of making sure you do partner with patients. So it's not us as researchers going out and projecting what we believe or what should be included in these experiments or surveys. So when we partnered with Myeloma Australia, that was the starting point. And then we reached out to people that they look after. So Nella, Steve, they could give us a lot of input about the people that they're working with. Obviously, then we did qualitative work. And qualitative work would pretty much be in every one of our types of work that we do. So we want to talk to people. Always starts with talking to people. So we spoke with patients, we spoke with carers, we spoke with nurses, and we spoke with clinicians, all leading up to trying to get their perspective, what was important to them, how should we frame these questions, do you understand the terminology that we're using, how long is the survey taking you, so it's not going to take too cognitively burdensome and you're going to get burnout from doing it. So all of those different aspects were included in all of our studies, and it's great to obviously work with a team like Steve and Nella at Myeloma Australia, but that is pretty much, we partner with a lot of advocacy groups, and that's always the starting point. So definitely making sure we talk to people at the start, and then ongoing we get their feedback. So even after people participate, we always talk to them about their experiences in doing the survey. I think I saw a question about someone asking as well about, do you talk to people about their preferences after they've done the survey? Definitely. And they can help give more insight about what they've seen. And a particularly relevant, I guess, for the one that Nella's talking about, shared decision making, is once people do that task on their mobile, we then have an interview, a talk with them, and they can reflect on what they found. And we get some great insights about what people are thinking and their values, and how that report represents them and what's important to them.
Thanks, Simon. This one's for you, Joe, if you want to turn on your camera. And I'm joining two here together again. Gerard asks, is there any example of decisions that were largely dependent on patient preference research at PBAC? And Karen has asked, has a study like the one Simon described ever been used in review of a drug at PBAC?
Thanks, Anne, and thanks for those questions. So I think it's fair to say that there's been submissions over the years that I've been involved anyway, that have included some patient preference data, either coming from a sponsor, so it's packed into their submission, or indeed there's been a couple of items that have been looked at by the committee over the years where some work has been done either through the sponsor post their submission or post their TGA regulation registration, or by a patient group themselves to support a submission. I think in terms of whether or not it's been, a substantive part of the support, the supporting sort of evidence and data that's, brought a decision forward, I think that would be hard to say, because basically it's been one of, data sets and other parts of the sort of submission box that means it sits alongside, if you like, all the usual material that makes up the requirements for a PBAC submission. I think the point I was trying to make was that I think there's more work to be done around, considering what's going to be the best place for patient preference work, and certainly, as I've said before to people, where it's best going to fit as well, in terms of earlier in the piece, in terms of either regulatory registration or indeed clinical trials themselves, and becoming part of the data sets that then are able to be used when we get to when sponsors get to a submission process for a HTA focus.
Thanks, Joe. That's got a bit of echo going there. Try again. Okay. Thanks, Joe. That's a really interesting point too about, you know, we're focusing at the moment around the reimbursement assessments, but for patient groups, you know, that's really just a continuum. And so what we're talking about today is hopefully something to consider across that continuum. There's a question here from Natalie, and she says, for rare diseases with small patient populations, data collection can be difficult. What types of data and what forms of data collections are acceptable to government agencies? And then I'll ask a second question after that one. So that might be one that you want to speak to first, Joe, and I don't know, other people may want to join in.
So, you know, I think those comments have been made before that, you know, for rare disease groups, it's difficult in terms of numbers for a range of different methodologies to be used. I mean, I think my experience here in Australia anyway, within both the LSDP program and as well as with PBAC, is that there's a lot of effort made to literally do personal interviews and surveys amongst the families and members of the rare disease areas to talk to them quite directly. There's also been a lot of work done internationally with rare disease groups to try and get a sort of more quantified sum of people together by utilising different rare disease populations amongst several countries to form, you know, if you like, a sort of a dossier at an international level. Yeah, I mean, I think it is it's a well-known sort of aspect to the rare disease area that some of these studies and indeed clinical trials themselves can be difficult. So I think that speaks to this point about having something that's going to always be able to be flexible and fit for purpose, depending on, you know, what the issue, what the item is and what the population variables are going to be.
Thanks, Joe. And the second part of that question is, will DCE provide the scale necessary for rare disease patients' experiences to influence HTA? And I know you've touched on that, but do you want? I muted myself too quickly. If you wanted to say some more, or Simon, if you wanted to come in as well, or in fact, Nella or Steve.
I'll let Joe go. Do you want to go first, Joe, or do you, I'm already on, so I can go. I won't touch on, obviously, from the evaluator's point of view. I'll leave that to Joe. But certainly, I guess, in regards to rare and scale, so these experiments can be done. You saw in the shared decision-making one, we were talking about individuals. There's slightly different types of modeling that we're using, but it can be done with low numbers. I think some of the recent ones that we published had, you know, we have 30 people, 50 people, we did haemophilia. So it doesn't have to be huge. I echo Joe's point about trying to reach out globally. A lot of the studies now have been looking to talk to multi-countries when it is quite rare. And I think that's a great initiative to look at people living with the conditions across countries. You can actually then pull them together. You can certainly look for differences, but we can get some greater benefit from actually thinking outside of just Australia, but people living overseas as well with the same condition. So I think to your point is, yes, you can do rare. And obviously, as I said, as these models work and we do more work in terms of collecting individual information, they can be taken down to that low level. Obviously, we haven't seen a huge amount of that probably in the HTA assessment process, but I guess as we move on going forward, I'm sure some of that type of work will be used in submissions.
There's a very different question here. I think this one's for Joe again. Are the environmental and waste features assessed along with clinical cost effectiveness and social and ethical aspects? That's interesting. That came up in a discussion recently when we were looking at the history of technology assessments, when it was, you know, in that broader area beyond health. Joe, how's that one for you?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly, but I mean, certainly with the you know, a range of different health technology assessment processes, there are things that are considered in terms of, if you like, offsets. So, you know, is there going to be a consideration of wastage in the way that something's going to be able to be used, or how it's packaged, or whatever? Is there going to be something that's able to be offset in terms of what may be less utilised, or less pressure on a particular aspect of the system if this thing gets introduced? So if I'm understanding correctly, there is a framework for the way offsets are considered and sort of juggled. But, you know, different agencies and different government agencies in particular have sort of criteria about what offsets are considered and what are, if you like, out of scope for a particular jurisdiction or a particular sort of format. Does that make sense, Anne?
Yeah, it does. It reminds me to ask you something slightly sideways from that, which we get asked a lot at Patient Voice Initiative. It's a little sideways to today, but people sometimes ask us about, is it worth commenting on minor submissions? And our understanding is that it might be because of, it might be to do with, you know, the way the dosage is or the packaging. But could you clarify that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't rule out minors. I think more and more over time too, we've seen that minors are, if you like, starting to become almost sort of small majors in their complexity. I mean, I think, I don't think there's a straight answer for this. I think one of the things I omitted in saying in my presentation was that the purpose of the unit, and people like Sally as the lead for the unit, Sally Wortley, is to also help give guidance with some of that. So if any of the patient groups or if any of the reps want to talk to someone like Sally about whether or not there's going to be a point in, you know, someone going to the effort of putting in some consumer comments or a patient submission to an item like a minor item, then, you know, ask and get some guidance on that, because some of the minors are pretty straightforward. And if I can be brave, I'll say, you know, are pretty much damn, you know, slam dunks. They're going to, you know, they're not going to be contentious. They're not going to require a lot of sort of effort. But there are other minors that might be quite important to a patient that are going to require some deliberation and some backwards and forwards, and that would benefit from having some patient perspective on that.
And my apologies, I introduced some jargon there. Now, Jo, can I ask you to explain for everyone what I mean by minor and major, or what PBAC means by minor or major?
Sure. So, I mean, a minor submission versus a major submission, in the time we've got left, I'll simplify it down by saying a major submission is usually a first-time submission. It's a submission that's very complex. It is going to require all the economics, all the financials and all the clinical evaluation to be carried out. It therefore means it's going to be an extensive evaluation and assessment done both externally as well as internally with the department and the committee. And it is going to go through an overview through DUS, the Drug Utilisation Subcommittee, and through ESC, the Economics Subcommittee. A minor, on the other hand, may be a resubmission that's only got a few things left to tidy up or sort through. A minor submission doesn't require the full dossier or the full box of all the materials again, and a minor submission is not going to require the external independent evaluation done through the universities, and it's not going to require as onerous and as in-depth assessment as you'd see for a major.
Thanks, Jo. I just want to do one last question, which is for Nella and Steve. If you're still on the line, I can see we're just getting up to the end, but there's a great question here. Do you see survey burnout in your community, Nella or Steve?
We ask ourselves that question quite a lot, but we also have, sorry, my dog has just put his head into the camera. Sorry about that. So Nella, I'll get you to go with that.
Sure. Yeah, so we don't seem to see survey burnout. We have a very engaged community who who provide feedback liberally. And however, we do filter what we put through. So we try not to overload them. We also get approached by a lot of external researchers as well to utilise our links with the myeloma community. And whenever we have one of those requests, we really sit down as a group and say, is this of value to our community, and is this something that we think is important for myeloma patients to participate in, and then what will they get back from it? So so sometimes that's a yes, and sometimes it's a no, sorry, we can't participate in this particular one. But we find, particularly with the nature of myeloma and the importance of new treatments, whenever we're asking questions about advocacy, drug access, treatment preferences, that sort of thing, we get very good engagement.
Thanks, Nella. That's a really good point to leave this session on, thinking about that burden for the patients who get involved and thinking about how to be selective about what work and what the priorities are there. I'm just going to finish quickly by sharing my screen, which is just to remind you of our resources and our update subscriptions at our website. You can join us on Facebook, you can follow us on LinkedIn. But the most important thing I want to say is, please, next Friday, we're going to be looking at patient-reported outcome measures. We're going to have Simone Layden from Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia, you may know it formerly as the Unicorn Foundation, as well as Professor Rachel Morton from the University of Sydney, who is an expert in this area. So I think it's going to be a really interesting session, slightly shorter with the two speakers, will just be an hour, so you can just sneak this session into your day, and you can register from our website or from Eventbrite. And finally, I would really like to thank our speakers this morning, Joe, Simon, Nella and Steve. Thank you for a really stimulating discussion. We're really pleased also to be able to have this recorded so that we'll be able to shortly put it online and actually watch some of this again, because there was an awful lot of content in the last hour and a half. And thank you to Jessica for opening us today. And we hope to see you again next Friday. So don't forget to register. Thank you.